and welcome everybody to session 3. We're in Zoom room 2. Your session today is Interdisciplinary Activities for Global Citizenship, and I'll introduce our speaker, Abby Watkins, in a second. Just a reminder for all those that are joining us to please rename yourself first and last name if you can. We are recording, so if you have to jump off or come back, not a problem. We will have that sent out March 1st. And I think that's all I'm supposed to remind you all. So I'm going to turn it over to Abby Watkins and let her start her presentation.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here. My name is Abby Watkins. I'm from an organization called Population Education. We're a national nonprofit based out of Washington, D.C., and we support educators to teach about topics that relate to the human population. And we do this in a couple ways. We create formal lesson plans and readings. They're all state and national standards aligned. We distribute those to pre-service and in-service teachers for free. And we also do professional development workshops, which this today would count as part of. Previously, we always used to do these in person. One of our amazing volunteers, Andrew Hunt, has been to this conference so many times presenting on behalf of Pop Ed. But in this digital world, I'm able to come to you live from DC today. And because of that blend of a analog world versus an in-person world, today, I'm going to go through some of our activities with you that have a focus on global communities and creating communities in our own communities and talking about those differences and ways that we can do this both in person and digitally. We've made some digital adaptations for most, but not all, of our activities, and we can use them. And I'll go through both of those with you today. You might hear population topics and think, okay, population's not in my standards. You know, why does that matter for me right now? Why might that matter to gifted students? But we take a really broad view of population at Population Education. And we look at all of the ways that people affect not just the environment around them, but also the way we form communities and we affect people. And it's very important to us at Pop Ed not to look at these topics in a vacuum, right? We're not just interested in resource use, but we're interested in how growing urbanization leads to more resource use and affects what resources we use, and how that in turn affects people's human rights and their public health. So all of our activities in general, but especially all of the activities today, are going to explore some of these connections among all of these topics while using these math and ELA and other practical skills to explore these science and social studies topics. At the end of our webinar today, I'll give you access to our elementary curriculum access pack. This has 45 lesson plans, those formal lesson plans I mentioned that are all matched to standards. They're arranged into units, they have readings, recommended children's books, all that fun stuff. It's totally free, it's yours forever. So once you get access to this, we won't take it away from you. And we do update it every couple of years or so in terms of both pedagogy, but also that content. So you can know that when you're using Pop Ed, that you are using relevant and updated and current ideas with your students. And, you know, we've been around since 1975, so I think you can count on us to be there for the rest of your teaching careers. So today, I'm going to demonstrate some of these activities that are good for making those community connections, like I mentioned. Please feel free to ask questions, even if it seems tangential. I love hearing tangential questions that create some of the best discussion. You can unmute yourself if you want. I might ask you to answer some questions at some point. But in general, you can kick back and relax. All of the stuff that I'll be talking about with any of these activities is present in those formal lesson plans. So you don't need to worry about whether or not you can remember every last detail. And so the first activity that I want to show you is called Crowding Can Be Seedy. And this is a lower elementary activity. And it's a very science-focused lesson, but we use these science skills to kind of create the building blocks for understanding our relationships to others and global community for these very young learners. And this is a two-part activity that is both a simulation that I'll go through with you and a gardening lab to follow it up. And in the first part of this activity, our students will place seeds in a flower pot. And the key vocabulary word for this lesson is what a resource is. And we want to make sure we scaffold that with our students because we're going to talk about a couple of different kinds of resources. But first and foremost, we want to talk about what resources does a plant need to survive. And you can pull this out of your students, use an example, and we know we need air and soil and water and sunlight are the things that can help our plants grow up big and strong. And what we do is that in this activity, we take a length of yarn, which is about 25 feet long, but you can modify that depending on your space. And we put it out in an open space in our classroom. You can do it outside if you need to. And we're going to use it not as a circle of yarn, but tell our students that this is a beautiful terracotta flower pot. And I like to have everybody close their eyes and relax, spend some time doing some imagination. And I always say, imagine that this is not a circle of string, but it is a beautiful terracotta flower pot. And it's in the sun in a beautiful garden. It's getting all sorts of water. The soil is really dark and healthy. But I'm a very sad gardener because I don't have any flowers in my flower pot. And my teachers in front of me, not my teachers, though I guess teachers today, my students in front of me are all little seeds that are ready to get planted in my flower pot. And so my visual representation of a scrunched down child may not be immediately identifiable, but we use this as a segue to talk about, what are seeds like? Are seeds sprawled out, hanging out, kicking their neighbor's chair, playing with their hair? No, they're potential energy, right? They're bundled up really nice and down low. So that's what we have. Our first volunteer, our student who's our very first seed, they come and stand in the flower pot and bunch down real low as a seed ready to get up and grow big and strong. But we as a class have to help them do that because, seeds can't do it by themselves. So we have a poem with some hand motions that we read together as class. And of course, you would want to make those ELA connections, spend some time actually going over the literacy of this, but I'll just read it to you and do the hand motions. So for your edification, it goes like this. The sun shines, the wind blows, the rain falls, and the little seed grows. And when we finish our poem, a student grows up big and strong, they're a grown flower. Now our first student has that flower pot all to themselves, and we always want to check, how's our student feeling? Does she have enough space to stretch out her leaves, stretch them really far? Can she put her roots deep in the soil and move them around? Can she sway in the wind? Get some of that physical engagement and also some of that social emotional learning, being able to articulate how she's feeling at that moment. And she's usually feeling pretty good. And so I'm a very happy gardener and I want to add some more students. And I add a couple more seeds and we do the same thing. We do the hand motions in the poem and our students grow up big and strong. And I do it again and again until we have a decent number of students in the flower pot. There's no prescriptive number of rounds that you need to do, but as you might guess from the title, the point is to be a little crowded. And after each round, we want to stop and talk to our students about how they're feeling. Check in with our very first student. Can she compare how she's feeling to how she felt at the beginning? Does she have more or less space? Can she stick her leaves out as far? But we also want to check in with the students who are at it in later rounds as well. Maybe our very last seeds that are planted, Do they feel like they've ever had enough space to wave their arms around as deeply as they would like? Probably not. If you want to extend the science learning, you can bring in discussion of those specific resources that I discussed at the beginning. For instance, you could, say the sun is shining from a light in your classroom and ask your student, are they getting enough sun? Are they in the shade now, as opposed to maybe how they were before? If you want to pretend to blow some air and the nice wind at them, can they feel that breeze? Why or why not? And just comparing those experiences after each round so we can get a sort of timeline of how everybody's feeling as they go through this activity. So I just wanted to show you some pictures of what this looks like in a second grade classroom. You can see in that first picture, we have some grown plants and we have some seeds and we have some arms and legs waving around at the end with our very crowded flower pot. And what we want our students to take away from this is that all the flowers have needs, right? They all need the same things as everybody else. And as we add more flowers to our flower pot, they have to share the resources with each other. They might have to rearrange in the pot to make room for their friends, because even though we add more flowers, the flower pot isn't getting bigger. We're not getting more sun in the sky than we had before. And we plant those flowers because we love flowers, right? Flowers are really fun, they're beautiful, they bring so much to our life. But when there are more people around us or more flowers, we have to make the effort to make sure that people have the things that they need. And after you finish up this demonstration, the discussion questions and the follow-up we have in the lesson plan are extrapolating the experiences of the flowers, maybe to the experiences of our students in the classroom. For instance, you might list out the things that the resources the flowers need and ask which ones are the same as people need. Do people need water? Yes. Do people need soil? Probably not as much, but there's something in the soil that people need too. And talk about resources that you share in your classroom. That's really easy for students to grasp onto. I have to share the good markers. We have to share, access to the watering fountain, all sorts of different things. And finally, extrapolating out to your community itself, in your town or your county or whatever works best for you. What are some things that everybody here has to share? Do we have to share our space with the people around us? Yeah, right? Do some people have more space than others? Probably. But how do we make sure that everybody has the water and the air and the nutrients that they need? Just building that idea of a larger community and our personal connections to those communities, even if we don't immediately see it, in a way that's really accessible to our youngest learners. The second part of this activity is a gardening lab. And I won't spend too much time on it because it's not too global citizenship oriented, but it's a really fun lab. You give students differing amounts of radish seeds and you put them in the same size pot. And students make predictions and spend a month growing their radish seeds. And we pick radishes because they're really hardy, they grow really well, but they're also, they can withstand a little rough treatment from maybe our amateur green thumbs in kindergarten. So it's really rare for students to not get accurate data in their experiment results. And of course, depending on the age of your students, you can have them do quantitative or qualitative assessments. They can count the leaves, they can draw pictures, they can use formal or informal measurements. The worksheet that's included with the lesson plan does take it creates a broad enough format that you can use whatever works for you and your students. So when all of our radishes are grown up big and strong, on average, you will probably see that the one seed will grow up bigger and stronger than the seeds that had to share with one another. But it's really important, of course, to contextualize this. Why would we grow 8 radishes rather than 1 radish? Because 8 radishes are more food. It gives more to us than growing just 1 radish. Why don't we just devote all of our resources to a really small number of plants? Because there are other plants that have needs as well. And talking about finding that happy medium between our 1 seed growing way taller than all of the rest and 8 seeds not being able to grow as well because they don't have enough resources allocated to them. So that is called Crowding Can Be Seedy. Again, it's a K-2 lesson, and everything that I mentioned is in that formal lesson plan. Do any of you have thoughts or questions or comments or anything before we move on? I want to make sure you will have space.
There's nothing in the chat, but feel free to ask throughout the presentation in the chat. We can always interrupt.
Absolutely. And say like in 20 minutes, you're like, oh, I do have a question about that crowding can be seedy. Absolutely. Love to hear it. But I'll move on for now because it doesn't sound like anybody has burning questions right now. But I want to share with you our second activity. This one's called Green Spaces. This is for an upper elementary classroom. And it's sort of a child's introduction to urban planning. It's expanding on that idea of community that we talked about in the previous lesson, but expanding the scale and allowing students space for a little more autonomy about what gets planned in their imaginary urban setting. So we start off this activity by talking about the oxygen that everybody needs to breathe. And we can scaffold that science. How does oxygen get made? What do plants do? What's that respiration process? But what we're really coming down to is talking about if we were just using grass, how large of an area of grass would be needed to make enough oxygen for every single person that lives in our class. And if we can let our students guess, establish the units and do whatever they think off the top of their head makes sense, but we can let them know that 25 square feet of grass would create enough oxygen for 1 person. But we're not talking about 1 person, we're talking about a whole class. So we want to see how much space is needed for all of our students. And if you are in person, we have students go outside onto, if you have a field available or any other green space available, of course, that's always the best, but you don't have to. You can go out into any space where students have the opportunity to spread out and give them some yarn and some popsicle sticks or other things to mark the 4 corners and practice some of that measurement to create a 25 square foot space for themselves. And we want to have every student have their own space so we can have a visual representation of what all that space looks like for all of our students. And we can talk about, well, what if we invited the class next door? How much more space might we need? Or the whole school? Would we have enough green space in our school to make oxygen for every single person? Maybe or maybe not. How we've had teachers doing this if they're teaching remotely is having students just measure out and mark the corners of a 25 square foot plot on a green space or inside, it's up to them, and posting a picture on their Blackboard discussion board or any other way that you're communicating this with your students.
Abby, did you see the question? Are there lessons for older children?
Yes. So I believe that this was specifically an elementary proposal, or at least that's what I was prepared for, but we do K-12 lessons. So we have an elementary pack that I'm doing today, but we also have a middle school and a high school pack. And I can show you one of our resources at the end for middle and high school students that has a lot of free lesson plans and other stuff on it. but I'll be talking about a lot of elementary stuff today. So here's my visual representation of students on their plots. They're all very happy breathing in that oxygen. But that's really just a hook to get into the main part of the activity, which is designing a city. And in this city, we have 900 squares for students to design on. And each of those squares is 5 by 5 feet. So it's comparable to those spaces that we mapped out in the first part. And if 400 people live in the city, each of them needs one of those squares to be green space to create the oxygen available to them. And so we have a physical worksheet in the lesson plan where students are quite literally coloring, but we also have a digital tool that I'll show you later that we can make available to you, where we're having students use a Google Sheet to use the fill tool and color in different parts of their city. But before they can get to the coloring, they need to know what the distribution of space is in our city right now. So right now, we used New York City as our basis for this distribution here. And looking at those land usage statistics, if there were 900 blocks, 369 of them would be housing. And there would be 54 commercial restaurant stores, et cetera, and so on and so forth. And we need to figure out how much space is left over to create green space for all 400 people that live in our city. And spoiler alert, there is not enough green space. And I really encourage you to look at some actual pictures of New York City when you talk about this with your students. They may think of Central Park as, you know, the most famous green space there, but there are other green spaces. And ask students, you know, how do they think New York compares to other cities? I was working with some Kentucky educators yesterday, and we found a planning commission interactive map of different land use in Louisville, for instance, that shows that their zoning is super different from New York City's zoning, for instance. And all of these cities, both in the US and around the world, are constructed in very different ways. So it's something for students to keep in mind. But looking at our city, we don't have enough green space available, so we want our students to make some changes to add some more green space. And we want them to take one of these types of land use that we see right here and think of ways that they could make changes that would allow for more green space to be added. And we give students sort of free rein to be as creative as they want, but it needs to be based on something real. So you could turn this into a longer term research if you wanted students to have actual examples from around the world that they could use to back up why, for instance, they want to have a more high-speed rail system so they can get rid of some of those roads and parking lots and allow those to be made into green space. And other suggestions are like urban gardening or creating multifamily housing so more people live in apartments so there can be green space near them. We leave it up to our students, but it can't just be everybody lives in one house, so we get rid of 368 plots of housing. We want them to base it in their understanding of cities in the real world. And once students have come up with those changes, you can have them do it individually, but I also think it works well in a group because they can kind of bounce things off of one another. We have them actually design their city. And I have a screenshot here of what our electronic city planning worksheet looks like. And you can see that there's a key on the side and the different squares have been colored in. And it's formatted like an actual city, right? We don't want just to have, 400 green spaces on top and then all of the housing and then all the roads beneath. But we want students to think about how these different parts of the city may relate to one another. For instance, does the housing want to be close to the factories? What about the stores and restaurants? Where do we want to put our schools and our libraries? Do we want one really big green space or do we want smaller parks and other outdoor areas littered around the city? And we have a space for a city name at the top of this worksheet because we really encourage students as they're designing their city to come up with a narrative about their city as well. You know, here in Green Gables, most people live in their individual houses and they live all across the city. There's lots of restaurants scattered around. And you can compare students to real cities that you see around the world because there are many different kinds of cities that are designed like this, for instance, using those different land use patterns to meet the different needs of the people in the city. We also have a lower elementary approach to this lesson that I'll just mention. It's called Our Town, and this is an activity that's really just focused on understanding the town or the city as a unit and as a place where things happen. So discussing what the types of buildings are, and what do people do in those buildings? What is a hospital? What happens in a hospital? Who works in the hospital? And we have students use boxes like shoe boxes or other small boxes that we've covered in butcher paper to physically design their own city with any buildings that they want, any buildings that make sense to them as being in their city. So that is called green spaces. Any thoughts or questions or anything before I move on?
Nothing in the chat. Question-wise.
I appreciate you staying on top of it. It's very helpful. So I'll move on to our last activity then. And this one is called World of Difference. And it's comparing the biodiversity of a temperate rainforest in North America to a tropical rainforest in Madagascar, and the ways that those different forests have different kinds of biodiversity and the different impacts that humans have on that biodiversity. This is again for an upper elementary classroom. If you're teaching older than elementary, we have a middle and high school version of this that's also called World of Difference, but it's World of Difference Uganda, and adds in some just more complex stuff than you'll see in this. So, but keep an eye out for that on our website. But in this activity, it's a two-part activity. Students construct imaginary forests and compare the biodiversity of those forests to one another, and then see how population growth in the United States might impact that biodiversity. So we start off with giving students sort of profiles of these two different forests and giving them different ways to represent the biodiversity in those forests in their constructed forests that they'll make in just a minute. When we do this in person, we give students different types of beans to represent different flora and fauna. And we pick beans because there are lots of different kinds of beans. So, you know, they're easily identifiable and they're pretty cheap and hardy and can handle students poking at them again and again. On our digital version of this tool, we use different colored shapes to represent the different animals. And once students have like established a key for what all of their flora and fauna will be represented by, they have 6 acres worth of each temperate and tropical forest that they will be populating with the different species found in each type of forest. And on the physical worksheet or on the digital worksheet, there are instructions about what is required for each type of species. So you can have up to 5 deer in each temperate forest, but you can't have less than 2. And you can only place 1 fossa because that's proportionate to the number of fossa that are found in the wild in Madagascar. I have some pre-built forests that we use at PopEd here, but what I really like about giving students the opportunity to build their own forest is that it means that no 2 students will have the same forests in either region, and it'll be different every single time. They could repeat the simulation and see something totally different from before. And once we have our forests, our pristine forests in the United States and in Madagascar, we want to add some complications to that. And because we are population education, we look at how population growth might affect both of these things. In the United States, we have temperate forests, and the human population is currently growing at a rate of 0.6% per year. Whereas Madagascar, where our rainforests are, the human population growth rate is 3%. And we have screenshots of the map here, but it's a great opportunity to explore some of those geographic skills with your students before we move on to the next part of the activity, looking at where Madagascar is located in terms of latitude, thinking about maybe some forests that we know in the United States. Have you been to a forest? What was your experience in that forest? And thinking about how people impact those forests maybe in a different way. And before we go on to the next activity, next part of that activity, we have both in our worksheets, digital and physical, students analyzing some images and thinking about how they might relate to deforestation and where they think that might be happening. So for instance, young students, if you tell them people are cutting down forests, they will probably think that we're cutting it down to make paper or to make buildings out of the logs, things that are really directly related to using the wood as a resource. And that's certainly part of it. In fact, in the United States, most of our deforestation that happens is from illegal logging. But Madagascar is quite different. And Madagascar, just like many other countries and other parts of the world, deforestation happens because of a need for space. And because people need space to live their lives. So we have our housing that gets built when there's deforestation. We need it to grow food, such as livestock or crops, both of them. And we need it to build roads and build other places for infrastructure. If you want to tie in a historical aspect in this, you can ask your students about, do they think that forests were ever cut down for these reasons in the United States? And yes, absolutely. We just did it earlier than other places did. So a lot of the forests that have been deforested in the United States have already been gone. So we can't look at them in the same way that we look at those Madagascar forests. But once we understand what might cause deforestation, how it might be unavoidable in some places, we want to simulate what happens to our biodiverse forests when we start cutting down acres that we had set up earlier. So we have students roll a die. We have a physical die that they use for if they're doing it in person. And on our digital worksheet, we have like an embedded die that students can click on to roll. And if students roll a 1, they will clear an acre of the temperate forest. And if they roll 2 through 6, they will clear an acre of the tropical forest. And that proportion is because the population growth rate in Madagascar is about 5 times as much as the population growth rate in the United States. So it's based on that real world data and, simulating the same thing that we might see in real life. And we have space for students to keep track of all of their roles and what happened. So they'll circle if it was a temperate or tropical forest cleared, which one of their acres were cleared. And then we want them to count up the number of different types of species that are remaining in each type of forest. And what happens inevitably is that because it's easier to roll a tropical forest number than it is the temperate forest, our tropical forest acres tend to be cut down more quickly. And because we have greater biodiversity in our tropical forest, but fewer of each type of animal, For instance, our fossa, which I think is a small cat that lives in Madagascar, is represented by this purple X. And as soon as you clear acre C of our tropical forest, then the fossa is gone in the tropical forest because it's already been depleted. Whereas with our temperate forest, you would have to clear every single acre to lose any of our biodiversity there. That's not to say that the odds are never defied when we do this activity. I had some students recently who rolled 5 ones in a row, and they cleared their temperate forest before they cleared their tropical forest. And that's a great opportunity to make some connections to where that happens in the real world. For instance, Singapore just accidentally cleared a huge amount of the forest that's available on their island because of a miscommunication among forestry initiatives. And sometimes our deforestation is affected by things other than just this human population growth rate. We don't want to put it all on just human population growth, but analyze that as one of many factors that may affect things. So if we had lots of time together, I would make you actually go through and do this, but we don't, so I won't. But what we tell students to think about while they're making this, clearing their forest, doing this biodiversity experiment, is just make some observations about what they see about biodiversity, deforestation, and human population growth rates. If you want to add in some, math concepts or other science concepts, you can talk about the correlation that shows in the relationships between these different things and talk about the different high correlation and causation might not necessarily be the exact same thing. But in the follow-up questions and the discussion questions and the assessment activity that we have associated with this lesson in our lesson pack, we're talking about the ways that we've seen this play out in other places in the world. In sub-Saharan Africa, around the Sahel, for instance, where we've seen a lot of deforestation related to population growth, that deforestation starts to lead to desertification. And just making those connections between the models that students are looking at in their simulation and recognizing that those models represent a real trend that we're seeing around the world. So that is my final activity. Let me just double check with Dustin. I had this on my schedule that we're ending at 11:10, am I correct?
Yep, 11:10's the.
Awesome. Okay, just wanted to make sure that it wasn't an hour and I wasn't gonna, leave you hanging for an additional 10 minutes. So we went over 3 lessons today. We did crowding can be seedy, that plant activity for young students, designing an urban world and green spaces, and then finally looking at those biodiversity differences in a world of difference, Madagascar. Let's see. I want to make sure that you all have access to that online elementary curriculum pack, as well as that other free resource I mentioned earlier if you are teaching older students. And let me get my chat box up. Sorry, I struggle with Zoom when I'm trying to share my screen at the same time. But I just uploaded into the chat box our access card for our elementary curriculum, Counting on People. And that'll give you all the instructions that you need to go get access to this account, this online curriculum library, and see all of the things available that I mentioned today, not just those lessons, but also more lessons. And I want to give you a real quick tour of what you might see in this curriculum pack. Like I mentioned, we have 8 different thematic units that are related to all sorts of different topics, people and wildlife, people and waste. So I'll click on meeting people's basic needs, right? We talk a lot about all of the things we have in common with other people. and the relationship we share when we all have the same needs. So I might click on When the Chips Are Down, which is a resource distribution game where students role play as different countries. And when you click on an individual lesson page, you'll get the place where you can download the lesson PDF, and we have the introduction and the procedure, discussion, assessment, and follow-up. You can see which subjects it best fits with, but also grade level, format, so you know what you're getting into before you start planning a type of activity, and the approximate time it'll take you both to prep as a teacher, but also in the classroom. We have a list of recommended children's books that goes along with. Lindsay, I see your question in the chat box, and I will get back to you in just 1 second. I'll lose my train of thought otherwise. Let's see. If you go into our recommended children's books, we have lists of associated books that work well with the themes of each one of our activities. We have a standard matching database on our website. So if you can search in one of two different ways, you can either search by standards. So you could search by Arkansas standards, but you can also search by NGSS and Common Core. And if any of you are headed to Canada anytime soon, you could search by the Canadian standards as well, and then subjects and grade level, and it'll show you all the standards that we have matches for that grade level and which activities do it. But also you could search in reverse. Say you liked, you liked World of Difference, and you want to see which standards it meets, you can search by that, and it'll bring up all of those standard matches as well. So just a useful tool, because we know that all of our educators are very constrained in what you're allowed, you have the space to teach. So we want to make it as relevant for you as possible. The last thing that I'll show you on this page is just that we also have some ideas for service and place-based learning that students can do to augment any of these units. Different grade levels, different types of activities, just because we think it's so important for students to build those relationships with their community early on. We want to have students actually do that, not just in the classroom. Finally, the last thing I'll show you on this website, I know I'm giving you a lot of information. In our teacher's guide, we have other resources, more stuff for you as teachers, some online interactive games that augment some of these concepts. But you can also search by subject if you're looking specifically, if you want a math lesson, for instance. People Count is taking a census of our community and seeing people's needs according to that. So that is our elementary curriculum pack. I saw a couple people mentioned in the chat box, or maybe just one person mentioned, and maybe some of you are feeling it. If you're not an elementary teacher, my email, you can email me and I'll email you the correct lesson pack. I'm not technically supposed to distribute more than one at a time, but I know that if you're a middle school teacher and you spend time at an elementary webinar, it might be frustrating. So my email is awatkins@popconnect.org. I encourage you to shoot me an email if I can help you in any way. We also have all of our social media on this page, and I encourage you to follow us there as well. We put free stuff there that we don't put anywhere else, and I run our Twitter account, so I have like a particular emotional attachment to that one, so you can look at it and just imagine me typing away on my laptop. The very last thing that I want to make sure I give to you all is that I mentioned those digital tools, and we have a public Google Drive where we've amassed all of our digital tools for K through 12, any of those lessons. And we have instructions about how you can duplicate them and use them for free however you want. These are all sorts of different kinds of digital tools. We have games where students are moving things around on the screen. We have worksheets. And I'll post this link right here into the chat right now, if I can.
And on that document that you uploaded in the chat, the guide, is it time sensitive, or would we could check?
No.
It's not limited to just like 2 weeks or a month?
No, it's yours forever.
Okay.
Yeah, the code will never change. So if you wanted to use it like 2 years from now, it would still be there, or 5 years from now. Yeah, we're a nonprofit, so we try to give stuff as free as much as possible. And that is all I have to share with you today. Thank you for dealing with some of my technical issues that flustered me a little bit at the beginning. But I hope you found some resources that are useful to you today, or at least you felt a little entertained. Again, here's my email address. If you want to shoot me any questions, ask for a different curriculum pack, I'm more than happy to send it to you. And I hope you all have a lovely rest of your conference.
Let's give Abby a hand. Thank you very much, Abby. I found that very helpful. I'm working on a K-5 social studies packet, so this worked right up my alley too. So thank you very much.
Awesome.
Some housekeeping. I'm going to stop recording.